Hey, good afternoon, Beachside. It is great to be with you. My name is Christian Magnell. I'm the lead pastor at Beachside Community Church. Hope you're having a great week, and I hope you're ready for the weekend to begin soon. It is Thursday. Today, I'm going to do a short two-part series leading into Sunday's sermon. As many of you know, we've been doing a sermon series at Beachside going through Matthew chapter 5, and this series is called Costly Discipleship and examines the idea of being a truly committed follower of Christ. This Sunday, we're going to look at the last 5 verses of Matthew chapter 5, which I'm going to put on the screen in just a second. And in these verses, Jesus challenges us to love our enemies. So let me put the verse up on the screen, and I'm going to take myself off because I've got kind of a busy slide, so it'll be easier to read if we just put the slide up. There we go. Okay, so Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, and this is Jesus speaking. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Okay, and again, that's Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. Now, there's a ton to unpack here, most of which I'm going to do Sunday. Today and tomorrow, what I want to do is key in on the first verse. Jesus continues a familiar pattern in the Sermon on the Mount, in which he reminds his listeners of a command or teaching they have heard. In this case, the teaching he reminds them of is they've heard it said, "Love your neighbor, but hate your enemy." Now that may seem counterintuitive to us. Today, we think, well, love everybody, love your enemy. We've kind of absorbed that teaching even if we don't follow it. But I want you to remember the context. Jesus is speaking to his fellow Jews, and they, the people of Israel, were historically surrounded by enemies. Nations and peoples who opposed them had different religious beliefs, tried to inflict their religious beliefs upon the people of Israel. And during the life of Jesus, Israel itself was occupied by the Romans. Now, that was humiliating at best, oppressive in reality, and Israel had been taught to oppose those who opposed them. They needed to fight for God, stand against idolatry, wickedness, unbelief. They needed to stand against those things. And the peoples who worshipped idols were their enemies in this regard. So the idea of loving your neighbor while hating your enemy would not have been foreign to the people listening to Jesus. It's here that Jesus adds his usual Sermon on the Mount twist. He says, "But I say to you," and just a little time out here, for those who haven't been following along the sermon series on Sundays, Jesus, being God in the flesh, is able to say, "But I say to you." So he takes an Old Testament command, an Old Testament teaching, and he's not repudiating it. He's not saying that doesn't count. What he's doing is expanding it, fulfilling it, explaining the spirit of law rather than just the letter of the law they've been following. So the twist here, he says, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." So your enemy is to be loved and prayed for. Love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. And that falls in line with what he's just been saying. He preached, and we covered this last week in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. The previous verses in which Jesus famously says, "Turn the other cheek, do not resist those who are going to hurt you." And I'm paraphrasing that, but he says, "Don't resist the evil person, turn your cheek, go the extra mile, give those who are begging, give those who are borrowing." So that was in the preceding verses. And again, we covered that last Sunday. I would encourage you, if you haven't, to watch the whole sermon so you get the context of what we're doing. So this passage is a continuation of that thought. Again, there's no paragraph breaks. Jesus is just speaking. It says, "Don't resist the person seeking to persecute you. Instead, what you are to do is to love them and to pray for them." So this raises a question: who is my enemy? Who's your enemy? For the Jewish people, it would have been easy to identify the occupying Romans as the enemy. Of course they were. That doesn't take a historian to know that. Well, maybe it does, but not a really, in-depth historian. That was obvious. And Jesus was certainly alluding to them. But what about us reading 2,000 years later? I mean, Jesus was speaking to a specific context, but those words weren't only for his listeners. So for us, love our enemies. Who is my enemy? Who is your enemy? Who are our enemies? I think there are two broad categories that I want to cover, and I'm going to do one today and one tomorrow. So, first of all, are those enemies that we choose. And then, secondly, those enemies who choose us. So, today we'll talk about those enemies that we choose. And here's the distinction: there are times that we nurse hatred, grudges, dislike, whatever you want to call it. And we may justify it, and there may be a really good reason. But it originates with us. We are feeling the hatred, we are identifying the enemy. And then there are those that harbor anger, resentment, ill feelings toward us. Now, there are times it may be truly 100% mutual, but it often originates with one person, either with a real or perceived offense or action. Now, you may protest. You have no enemies. And even as I was writing this, I thought, well, I don't think I hate anybody. I don't think I have anybody that I would identify as an enemy. And technically, that is true. But, and here's the but, my actions or your actions may be different than what you claim. So you may say I have no enemies, but do your actions really bear that out? I may say that I don't have an enemy. I may say I don't hate anybody, but is that true of all my actions? Are all of my actions truly consistent with somebody, myself in this case, saying I have no enemies? And the reality is they aren't always consistent. So who we might choose, whoever we might choose to hate, whether consciously or subconsciously, we do have those that we're in conflict with. And by the way, as I'm doing the video, my son's pulling up, so you'll see him probably walking in. I think he might be coming with pizza, but I don't know. So let's talk about those enemies. Why? Why would we have enemies or those that we feel resentment or anger toward? Well, on the one hand, there may be those we sense are in our way, dealing with financial gain or job gain or relational gain. Second, there are those elements in society who we oppose, where they have different ideas of where we think things should go, or philosophies or religions or political statements or things like that. You may have heard, there's an election coming up, and I've heard both sides claim, Republicans and Democrats say, victory by Biden or victory by Trump is going to mean destruction for our nation. It's going to destroy democracy. If you believe that about the other side, and listen, I'm not here to debate whether or not any of that is true. That's a whole different subject for not a church video. That's something for you and your friends to discuss. But if you believe the other side is going to destroy your nation or destroy democracy, wouldn't they be your enemy? I mean, even if you don't hate them, aren't they at some level an enemy of yours? If you think, well, this group, this political party, this person getting elected is going to spell the end of the United States of America, at the very least, you're identifying at some level as an enemy or an opponent. What about foreign enemies? Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Chinese Communist Party, and so on? You would have to concede that they're enemies of yours in some fashion. So think about what Jesus is saying. Love them. Don't just love your neighbors. Don't just love those that think like you. Don't just love those that are going to support and defend your nation and your democracy. Love your enemies. Now you might protest, well, come on. Are we supposed to love the terrorists who are going to blow things up? Well, Jesus is telling the people of Israel, love your enemies. And they would have been very obviously the Roman authorities who wanted to institute idolatry, and they did eventually destroy the temple and put up an altar to Zeus. They wanted to snuff out Israel as an independent nation, which they did, and Israel didn't exist again for almost 2,000 years, 1948. So if Jesus is saying to them, love your enemy, he has to mean for us, then we've got to love the people that oppose us. So can you love your political opponents? Can you love people rioting in the streets? Can you love terrorists who threaten our country? Can you love someone who stopped your job promotion or ruined your marriage or personally hurt you? Somebody that you're angry with? Well, the answer is yes. We can and have to, as Christians, love them. But here's the key thing: we can't do it in our humanness, in our humanity. We can't just say, well, I've got to love my enemies, so here I go. I'm going to love them. It has to be from God. We can't do it ourselves. We can only love our enemies when we 100% surrender to God and Jesus Christ. And then our priority, our focus, our purpose is completely taken over by God. That's how you love others. We're going to pick up with this tomorrow, and then obviously Sunday, this is the theme of the sermon. But it's something for you to think about. I want you to be thinking today about who is it that in your life is an enemy. Even if you don't say you hate them, who is it that you are opposed to? And then tomorrow we'll think about those that oppose us, those that we didn't choose as enemies, but we find ourselves being hated by them. So we'll pick this up tomorrow. We'll think about enemies more in depth. We'll focus on those who have hurt us and what it looks like to love in that way. Sunday, we're going to unpack all of that and the verses I just read. But until tomorrow, have a great day. God bless you, and we'll talk soon.